Hello and welcome to this webinar around 360 feedback for deskless workers. My name is Christian Nielson. I'm joined by Matt Wride, DecisionWise president, and we are excited for today's conversation. Well, it looks like we'll have having folks joining us here. We're trying a different platform for these webinars this time. We're excited. Hopefully it's a good experience for everyone as we try to make these better each month. This session, a couple of housekeeping items as we get started. This session does qualify for 1 hour of HRCI and SHRM credit. That information will be available after today's session, as well as I believe we will be sharing these slides if that's requested, or at a minimum, we'll sharing a video of the today's session. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We will have some time for chat and questions from the group. So please, we love when these sessions are interactive. So a little bit about where we're headed. We're going to talk about deskless workers. We're going to talk about 360 feedback, and we're going to discuss how the two meet and some ideas for getting it right, some of the unique challenges faced by deskless workers, and some of the techniques we found that are things we need to really consider when we're working with this important employee population. We did have a session on deskless workers last November, and so I thought I'd just start with some basic slides as we talk about deskless workers. What is a deskless worker? The term refers to employees who don't primarily work at a desk or in a traditional office setting. Often they're on the move, engaging in tasks that require physical presence or some kind of mobility. And it's not a small group of the population. This is a group of employees that we all rely on daily. It's an operational backbone of many businesses, many services. We'll look at some specifics in a moment, but it's also a lot of our frontline customer interaction is with deskless workers. There's a need of flexibility, specialized skills. You can kind of get a feel for why these deskless workers are so vital to our way of life and to just modern business, modern civilization. A couple of examples just to kind of prime our minds of who we're talking about. And I know we've got a lot of folks on the call that work with different segments of deskless workers. So love any feedback on other categories or groups, but here I've got a few slides that just walk through, in the retail, healthcare, field service, construction, certainly a lot of these roles, delivery and logistics, hospital staff, manufacturing workers, ag workers, utilities, energy workers. We work with a number of organizations in that space, and certainly the majority of their employees would fit into this deskless category. Let's see.
You know what? One thing I was going to point out too is sometimes we call them deskless workers. They may actually have a desk. It's more about the nature of what they do. They're on the go. They're moving about. They may have a home base for 10 minutes of the day at a desk somewhere, but they're out and about. So it's not like there's no desk involved. Like a nurse may sit down and do a lot of reporting for a few hours at a station. But generally, they don't just sit all day and kind of work from one single location.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's a good point. We're not saying that these folks never get a chance to sit down, but they may periodically have a desk. I think a nurse is a good example of that, where there's these stations and things, but maybe they either share them with others or they're only there for a fraction of their workday. I think through transportation, a lot of folks check email when they're at the home base, but they're out on the road or out in the field the majority of their time. So some other categories here, but there's so many different roles that fit into this deskless term, this group of employees. One stat that I was able to find, worldwide, 2.7 billion employees would be considered deskless workers, 80% of the global workforce. So actually, it's most of the employees in the world fit into this deskless category. So it's an important group to consider and to really think through that as deskless workers, they face some unique work environments, unique challenges. I want to list a few of those unique challenges, but I also want to open it up to the group. If there are other categories or other challenges that we can think of that are kind of unique to this deskless population, let's get them in the chat. Lauren asked a good question. Remote workers in home offices would not fall into this category, correct? It's an interesting thing because I think some of those unique challenges that we're about to talk about would also apply to remote work. And some are fit into both categories, but a lot of times, a lot of modern remote workers are kind of tied to a computer, sitting down, and wouldn't necessarily fit the pure definition of deskless, but there's, I think, a big overlap in some of the unique challenges that we'll be chatting about today.
A question I have that I'd love to throw out there to the audience and see what throws into the chat is how many of you that manage or have deskless workers as part of your organization, how many of them have like email and formal technology that you give them? And how many don't really? Like, that's always a challenge for us as we think about how we interact with them. I do know that the amount of technology for deskless workers is going up, right? I mean, whether that's mobile, whether those are corporate communication platforms, things like that. But I'm curious how many have email addresses and kind of fixed technology that they're able to use to communicate with these people? Looks like we've got a couple that they're giving them tech.
I think increasingly we're seeing more, but I think there's some domains, especially, hospitality, we don't see as often as much tech there. Agriculture, some of that, but and mobile device are becoming more ubiquitous. Where 10, 15 years ago, not as much, but it's good to get an understanding.
For a long time, we had a long-standing relationship with the Cheesecake Factory, and I remember they had very little tech, and over the years, they increased the amount of tech that was available to their hospitality workers. So,
Cheryl makes a good point. Most do not. We're a factory. They have iPads that complete the work instructions, but not to receive email. Yeah, and so that I think is a really good segue into some of these unique challenges of deskless workers. I think the first one I've got listed here is limited access to technology. Even when we give them tech, the tech is a little bit differently, or they're not as completely immersed in it, or it's periodically checking email versus Matt and I can't seem to get away from email all day long, versus it might be once a week, it might be once a month, it might be once a day, but there's a different cadence or a different level of frequency that are able to access that. But limited technology. I saw one stat that was interesting. We mentioned that even that 80% of the world's employees would be considered deskless. Only about 1% of enterprise software investment is focused on deskless workers. So most of the tech investment isn't geared specifically for this population. I think that's something to keep in mind, especially as we're talking about what we like to focus on, which is how do we capture and clarify the voice of the employee? How do we access employee experience and employee feedback to improve and help individuals and teams and groups and organizations improve? Another challenge, which is I think very tied to that, would be communication barriers. That it does, because they may not be as tied to their technology, or just by the nature of that mobility and flexibility we talked about, they may not be as readily available for communication, or there are more barriers for us to actually get information to and from our deskless workers.
And that's a real challenge, right? As our focus on the 360 is to help grow and develop those employees. But if it's hard to get them to check email, if it's hard for them to sort of, catch a vision of what we're trying to do, it can be a real challenge. So one of the key things is to remember that as you implement 360s, you've got to think about how you're going to communicate with these folks.
Yeah. And often, again, these kind of all blur into each other a bit, but often because of, the nature of their role, it makes it more and more difficult for us to really invest or focus on, or we neglect the priority of focusing on training and development opportunities for our deskless populations. They're out and about. They're not as easy to pin down into classical training environments, or they're just moving around so much that it's not as much top of mind for growth and development. And so often this group really suffers a bit, or doesn't have as many opportunities for growth and development. And that's one of the main things we're excited to talk about today with 360 feedback, but certainly a challenge for this group. Physical and safety hazards, nature of the role. Obviously, there's such a wide variety of deskless roles that this differs in different areas. But in general, they're exposed to a lot more, in just in terms of slip and falls. If they're working in factories or manufacturing, agriculture environments, healthcare settings, there's so many areas and potential risks, and so those are some unique challenges that our deskless peers often face. Work-life balance, that can be true in terms of deskless. It depends on roles. I mean, most of us face this, but there's some unique aspects to that. I'm thinking a lot of shift work and changing things, and just the hours that our deskless populations often work. That is one of those components. Disconnected for company culture. I think this is an interesting one. It's something we're really passionate about. I'm curious if anyone's got any take on this in the comments or the chat, but feeling disconnected from company culture. If I put myself in the role of someone that's, in some kind of trucking or transportation, if I'm out on the road, how much am I connected to the identity of the organization I work for? I think in some cases there's some amazing efforts that work very well, but a lot of times our deskless population feel a bit less connected to the overall organization just by nature of their work and the level of interaction they may or may not have with company messaging, company vision, goals, successes, those type of things.
And that's why you have to be intentional. I mean, we measure company culture, right, by measuring employee experience, which is in essence culture through the eyes of the employee. We know you've got to be intentional. I reflect back on some of my deskless jobs. One summer I worked construction. I went to just wherever the job site was. I don't think there was ever a time that I actually, other than the day I started and the day I turned in my stuff at the end of the summer, I don't know that I ever went to the office at all. And so how do I build a connection to a culture when I was just showing up, doing my work and getting out of there?
Yeah, I think it takes a deliberate effort to help connect those dots and to maintain it. It can't just be, these one-time efforts. There's got to be a cadence of efforts. Yeah, it's very interesting. And the next one on this is something I think that a lot of us that have been in those deskless roles, and I like that you brought up your experience, because I've certainly had those roles in the past. Limited opportunities for recognition. I think through my illustrious career as a forklift driver, as I was going through, undergrad, and I remember thinking, does anyone know if I'm doing a good job, or does it matter? Who sees this work? I certainly took pride in it, but there was that feeling of, am I viewed as just part of the machinery here? And so that recognition piece, I think, certainly applies a lot to all humans in a work environment, but our deskless folks, I think there's a unique lens on it that we need to really consider. Lack of team connection. I mean, connected to the company, sometimes our teams. Now, in some environments, the team is who we connect with, because they might be deskless along with us, and we interact with them, and that might be where we feel those connections. But in other instances, it might be you're not working with the same people twice, and so that you never really form that same sense of team, and that can be a challenging thing and makes us disassociate a bit, and also can lead to lower levels of engagement, because it's we feel like there's less to engage with, and so that team aspect as well is very important. And limited voice.
While we're here to talk about 360s, I think most people know that DecisionWise, we measure organizationally as well. And that's why when you do your org surveys, it's important to think about specific questions that address these unique challenges. Like, where are your managers that do a great job of team recognition? Where are there silos of dysfunction, but you need to be thoughtful about gathering that information so that you can do something with it, because you've got to uncover it. And one way to do that is to ask employees directly.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the org side, because I can't help but think of that either in terms of having those demographic filters, so that you can say, you look at a recognition question and see, do your deskless employees feel differently than your office employees or your folks sitting in cubes? And to the comment earlier, your remote employees also, how do they feel? And just being able to filter the different items through those lenses. All right, let's well, as I mentioned, I think I'm going to single one out here: lack of training and development. In fact, this is a good question for the group. We're excited to jump into the 360 conversations, but I'm curious. We come here to learn from each other as well. And so, if there's other things you're doing, I'm curious, how have you successfully supported the growth and development of deskless workers? If there's any insights from the groups in terms of specific techniques or programs that have helped these folks grow, we'd love to glean some of those.
And while those answers come in and you're monitoring the chat, I just want to frame why we believe 360s are important to growth and development. It's a way that the individual can be part of the process, right? They can understand their own blind spots, and they can begin to sort of take control over their growth. That's the advantage of the 360. We'll talk about it later as a disrupting event or a disruptive event. Because so much of what we think of is it happens to me, but when we use a 360, they become part of the equation. And they're saying, okay, I've received this feedback. Now, what do I need to do to sort of leverage my strengths or fix a few key areas? So that's why it's important. 360s are important to growth and development.
Right, really good points. I like Emily's point here around using HCM system app on phones. That's such an interesting journey we've seen. Early when I started in this space side of employee voice, employee feedback, people were a little bit nervous about using their phones. This is my phone. If it was a personal phone, and people would be resistant. And so texting and some of those things, we are seeing more and more willingness, especially to take a survey or to complete a 360 assessment on a mobile device. If it's a personal mobile device, we are seeing a much more openness to that. But in the past, it was, I don't want my company using my personal phone number for these type of things. But generational expectations changed pretty quick around technology, and we are seeing certainly folks being more open to that. Although the texting thing, I think we'll talk about in a bit, not as much of a preferred channel as you might think. So Matt set the stage. Yes, why we believe very strongly in the power of 360 feedback. But one thing that I take from our friends in the healthcare space is do no harm. We don't want to punish people with feedback. We don't want things to get worse in our organization or worse for an individual because we engaged in a 360 feedback process. And I say that because you can do some damage if you don't do this the right way, if you don't do it ethically and responsibly, and work, follow some best practices. So 360 can be very powerful if it's done very well. So, but just to get us all on the same page, very quick, let's talk about what 360 is. 360 is an assessment where someone fills out, responds to some items about themselves, some survey or assessment items about themselves. They also get to compare their self-perceptions with perceptions from their supervisor. Typically, if they've got direct reports, they would be included. Peers, others, will talk about different rater groups. But really, it's the same view. How does my view of myself and how I'm doing in different leadership competencies or behavioral competencies, how does that compare to how other people are experiencing me? And where are their gaps? And where can I potentially close some blind spots?
I would just point out, one of our clients over the years was a large industrial supply company, and we were doing 360s even for first and second year associates in that organization, because they wanted to begin to create a culture of feedback, and to realize that progress, self-awareness may be the single most important characteristic you develop as a leader or as an effective employee. So it doesn't have to be 360s only for those that are approaching manager or something like that. You can deploy 360s across the entire organization.
There are so many places where 360s can help strengthen an employee experience, improve L&D efforts. I think it's a really good point. What's interesting is a lot of organizations that we work with, we find that they had one view of 360 in their mind. Oh, it's only for underperformers, or it's only for our executives, or they think they have kind of this view of it only fits a certain category. But I believe I've even got a resource here in a moment that kind of walk through some of the various ways. But there's so many use cases. They do offer so many areas of value. In fact, let's look at just some quick things. And I threw a couple of these on here, but my goal is really, we've got a ton of free resources at DecisionWise.com/resources, and they're not behind you don't have to give us your information to get that. It's just, you can download it. We put a ton of stuff there. Infographics are great, quick hits like this, but there's a lot of wonderful value in 360 feedback around self-awareness, clarifies behavior, measures how things get done. There's so many great things about doing it. For example, one of the challenges we see with a lot of managers, especially new managers, is we promote people and we don't tell them, oh, by the way, we now expect these different behaviors from you as a manager. And so, 360 can help not only measure behavior, but communicate expectations. So there's a lot that can be done.
And I hope one point we can get across in this conversation today is we don't have to, 360s aren't some long 50 question survey or assessment that's, well defined. They can be as simple as 15 questions. So in your example, Christian, where you're running a forklift, we might want a behavior that listens to instructions, right? Listens carefully to instructions. You can have 15 question 360s and still get a lot of value out of them. And our technology's come a long way that instead of it just being sort of this standardized process, you can adapt it and it can be short and quick, but still be meaningful.
That's such a good point. In the comments, it may have been Emily or that mentioned it before, but they, mentioned that people aren't likely to check their email. They don't want to do it on their time. So time is of the essence with a lot of these deskless populations. And so to your point, being really deliberate in terms of the assessment design, the instrument, this is a population that we need it to be able to be completed in 5 minutes, or, what have you, or it's not the same as the assessment we give our C-suite, but getting it dialed in for that audience.
And that's one of the great things about what we do. And I just point out is that we have 80 competencies built in so that you can mix and match and find if the competency is about responsiveness versus decision-making, right? And you can build the right assessment for the right group.
I love that. And I'm just looking also at our we asked a minute for call outs on how we develop. And, Lauren mentioned monthly syncs to talk about trends and share group training efforts. Really great. I like that it's on a monthly cadence like that, because these are populations that if we don't schedule it, a lot of times it doesn't happen. But it sounds like you've got some really good things dialed in there. One of my favorite things, just before we get into some specifics for how to dial these in for deskless workers, one of the things we talk about quite a bit, and this is, I pulled from this slide specifically from our 360 coaching certification, but the Johari window. A lot of us might be familiar with this. But if you've ever met a consultant, they love 2x2 frameworks, and I am no different. But this kind of illustrates the power of the problems that 360s help us solve. There are things that are known to ourselves and not known to ourselves. There are things that are known to others about us and not known to others. And a 360 helps us in some really specific ways. So things that are known to ourselves and known to others, that's in the public arena. everyone knows that I like X, Y, or Z. And it's not a surprise to either of us. And so that those are in the public arena. It might be strengths, might be areas of opportunity for me. I might be really volatile. Hopefully that's not the case, but or I might be a really good public speaker. And basically this is illustrating there's things that we might all know. There are also things that are known to myself, but not known to others. And that could be a facade. Either it hasn't come out, my volatility hasn't come out, those situations haven't arisen where that would happen. Or perhaps I've got a real strength that just it hasn't been on display at work. But there are things in that facade, things that I know that others don't know. Sometimes the 360 will highlight some of those areas, those facade areas. But there's a real, this next area is kind of the sweet spot for a 360 where the value can really come in, where it's something that others know, or at least that's how what they're experiencing, but it's not known to me. And a report can give me that information, and I can at least have the opportunity to decide, is this something for me to take action on, or is this going to be something that it would be worth making an adjustment in my behavior and my approach, my attitude? And then there this category that's not known to self, not known to others. Usually 360s have a harder time surfacing that, although sometimes coaching conversations can surface some of these things. But the Johari window, and by the way, it's called that because it was created by Joseph Luft and Harry, and they just merged their two names. It sounds more mystical than that, but it is a useful framework. And by the way, this is something I often recommend in a pre-webinar, whether it's deskless workers or not, as you're talking about, hey, why would we do a 360? Here's why. Because there are things you don't know about yourself that other people are experiencing. And that's powerful information for you to have. So we talked a little bit about what a 360 is mechanically. We talked about the value that comes here, but there's also this question, or I like to think of it this way. What experience are you creating for others? A 360 helps us answer that. And especially in the coaching conversations that accompany it, we often see this. Is it the right experience? How are other people experiencing you? And is that the right experience? It's the right experience if it's going to lead to outcomes that you're comfortable with, or outcomes that are good for the organization and the individual. But these are powerful questions. I often use the analogy of hearing your voice played back on a recording. You're like, oh, do I really sound like that? Well, for, let's say, a manager, oh, do I really lead like that? Or an individual contributor, do I really show up that way at work? Is that how other people experience me? Because, that's not my heart, that's not my intent, or that's not going to lead to the outcomes that I'm comfortable with. But a 360 helps us answer these important questions at an individual level. We'll jump right into the deskless side really quick, but I do want to share this quick definition. A 360 is also a purposefully designed disruption which creates the opportunity for increased self-awareness and change. This idea of a disruption is really powerful. We don't often stop and look at how other people are experiencing us in such a structured way to get feedback in an actual report with very specifics. Here's what I thought, here's what they thought. What's the delta or the gap there? And that creates this moment where energy goes up, where, oh, I didn't realize that. And if it's handled correctly, that moment can lead to some really powerful change. And so thinking about 360s as a disruption is something that creates the possibility for change is a really great way to look at them. If you pair them with another leadership and development program, suddenly it creates an openness for learning and growth, because there's this self-awareness used at the beginning.
Christian, there was just a thread in the chat highlight was about a question about reverse mentoring, which is this notion where older workers actually are paired with younger workers in order to do a knowledge exchange and mentoring from newer perspectives, new insights. And it looks like one of our participants has some information about it. But years ago, I wrote an article on it as well, having been the recipient of reverse mentoring sat down and asked someone to mentor me in some technology issues, and it was a really great experience. But it goes to this question, and how I'm going to tie it back to the slide that you have is all of these tools are designed to facilitate great conversations. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to use this as an opportunity to gather feedback. But if we just gather feedback and it sits there, it's not great. But if it becomes a conversation and it becomes a dialogue, then we're making headway. We're doing something that's going to be productive.
Yeah, really great points, and I appreciate that conversation in the chat. All right, so let's talk about some specifics, and some of these are universal, but I want to talk through the eyes of what we need for our deskless population. I've got 6 kind of tip areas: define the purpose, choose the right tech, train participants, ensure confidentiality. Some of these seem a little bit straightforward, but I want to look at it through the deskless lens. Choose the right raters and incorporate coaching. So let's talk about each of these a bit. All right. Define the purpose. I had a mentor here at DecisionWise years ago that mentioned, he used to use the line, "What's obvious to you that's not obvious to them?" In terms of communication. For a lot of us in HR, some of us are really bought into feedback and 360 feedback, and we see all the power. That doesn't mean everyone else sees it. And so whenever we roll out a program, especially with our deskless workers, if they're not as accustomed to this type of exercise, we want to be very deliberate. Why are we doing this? What is the benefit for the individual? What is the benefit for the organization? What are we hoping to accomplish? And this is where I just put a thumbnail of a resource I like that's on our website, the 12 ways to use 360 feedback. And there's some good things in there, around developing senior leaders, team building, enhancing L&D, all these good things. But my point on this is really, we've got to be very clear. It can be very, people can feel very vulnerable when they're told they're going to receive feedback. And so we want to make sure there's a very clear why. Why are we doing this? Especially if it's an opportunity to pair this with recognition. Hey, we believe in you and we want to invest in your development. Therefore, we're doing this. And so we mentioned that recognition is often a challenge for this deskless population. This could be really paired with this idea of, we see your potential and we want to invest in your growth.
I want to also take a moment though and frame it that a lot of times we communicate the why to the individual employee that's taking the 360, but there's an other why, and that is rather than this being viewed as an HR program or something like that, it's actually a tool for managers. In other words, the why is, hey leaders, we're giving you a way to help gather some feedback about your employees, and then for you to step in and have conversations. So this isn't just something that we do because it's a nice thing that HR wants us to do. We need to frame it as, hey leaders, we're giving you a tool that's going to help you build the teams and future leaders in this organization. So that's another component to the defining the purpose.
Yeah, a really good call out. And just to paint the picture of where there's real value. And we do that in our coaching sessions too, that we try to make sure that this isn't something being done to them, it's done for them, and help them. That really changes it.
And done with them, right? That's the point of the coaching, is we're gonna do this together.
Yeah, really, really great distinction there. Choose the right technology. Matt, do you want to chat about this one and why tech matters more than anything for the deskless folks?
And I don't want to make this an advertisement, and so, but the point is when we sit down to gather feedback in the context of multi-rater, right? We're trying to get perspectives from various people. We need to make sure that the technology can accurately gather the feedback and can sort of invite the right people to participate in the process. The only thing I will say is standard survey software, while you can sort of make it work, there's a lot of chewing gum and duct tape needed. Technically speaking, that's a technical term, I guess, to make it work. And so a purpose-built tool is always better because it allows you the ability to approve raters. It allows you the ability for someone to self-select raters, to add vendors and outside participants to the process, right? So with some deskless workers, we may have more feedback coming from customers and brand ambassadors than we may have coming from team members. And so we need a tool that allows us to gather those perspectives. And so you just need to be thinking about that and realize it's probably worth looking at a specific 360 tool rather than trying to get a survey monkey to do it for you, because it's a pretty big challenge.
And also, I think HRIS is important to bring up here. We're seeing more and more HRIS systems that have some limited functionality for 360, and the functionality is a consideration, but also the perceived confidentiality, which we'll talk about later too. I think especially for our deskless population, the trust is so key, and there's also maybe some suspicion.
Yeah. How have we solved it? Yeah, you get all the access to the tech, but we've designed it so there are certain areas that we're not going to let you in the tech so that you can't break confidentiality.
Right.
As the HR leader who's got access and you've got a login, you can't just see everything. Well, you can if that's what you communicate to your employees. But if you want to preserve confidentiality, you can say, we have a third party and they don't even let us into certain areas of this tech in order to preserve that confidentiality.
Right. Versus the experience, if I'm an employee that is suddenly asked to provide feedback in the same system I request PTO, then I'm like, well, this HR, everybody's going to see this, so I'm either not going to respond or I'm not going to respond honestly. So choosing the right tech is super important for accessibility and trust, as well as ease of use on your part. Training participants. This is as proud as we are of our tech, and as proud as we are of our report and our IP and all our competency library, all those things, there's no substitute for helping people get through a very human experience. That, hey, I'm going to get feedback, I'm scared. How do we train people to kind of overcome that? But also, it's not just the participant, the person receiving the report. There could be efforts made to help train your organization on healthy attitudes towards feedback and providing feedback as a rater in these sessions as well. One thing I'll refer back to a few times is our 360 certification that we train people on coaching. But one thing I recommend in a lot of pre-webinars, I love that Johari window we spoke earlier, but I also love the Sarah model. The Sarah model is something that is going to look familiar to the stages of grief, which actually makes sense because when we receive feedback in this way, we're almost losing a bit of our sense of self, or we're at least challenging how we see ourselves and trying to reconcile how others see. And so there are some interesting kind of similarities, but you'll see that the Sarah model stands for surprise, anger, resistance, acceptance. And occasionally we use Sarah with an H, where we're trying to not only get to acceptance, but we're trying to get to a place of hope. The H at the end would be around hope, where we want people to actually leave the experience with optimism and excitement that I've got this information, I can now use this going forward. But this model is useful because I like to introduce it before we go through the feedback experience and say, hey, it's a natural thing when we receive feedback to go through some or all of these stages. It might be a surprise. That might actually hit our ego a bit. We might be a little bit angry or feel some emotions when we see something that we disagree with, or if it is such a surprise. And then we might have a tendency or natural inclination to resist that. That doesn't help us get better. It's only when we get to a place of acceptance and hope, and ideally hope, that we can actually move forward. And so by introducing this model early, by training participants and say, hey, it's okay to feel this, to experience this, to feel some of these things, but let's recognize it and deal with it when it emerges. If you do introduce that early, then you can use that language later in the sessions So then, as the feedback comes in, if I'm coaching somebody and they're obviously in one of these stages, I can say, remember that Sarah model we talked about, and it can be a really great tool. So this is one of my favorite models for training, but there's so many other things you can do to help train not only the participant, but also the raters to make sure that they have productive feedback to provide.
And just the Sarah model is great because it helps the person going through the process kind of understand the feedback and kind of go through it. But it's also great for managers because they can understand and help guide someone through it. So it's both recognizing someone going through it as well as understanding it ourselves if we're experiencing those emotions.
Yeah. And a lot of times, and I'm generalizing, there's so many versions of what a deskless worker is, but a lot of times our deskless workers are in populations where there are more frontline employees. They are less familiar with formal feedback. And so their guards are up, and understandably so. And so helping to kind of set the tone with this group, it's okay to feel these things, but it's going to be important for us to get past it.
Just remember the first time you get yelled at by a customer, you go through this, right?
Yeah, that's right. That is right. That is difficult feedback to receive. Keep it confidential. This seems pretty straightforward for any time we're capturing employee input in this kind of structured approach, but it can't be stated enough. And as I mentioned, you're going to have some potential conspiracy theorists within deskless populations. You have them in every employee population, but especially in deskless populations where they're less familiar with it, they may be further down in the organization. And so conditions are right for them to be a little bit suspicious about how this information is being used, what it is, what it isn't. We want to make sure, kind of going back to selecting the right tool for this, that you're able to communicate confidentiality. Now, we always use confidentiality as a term instead of anonymity, because we don't keep it anonymous. We in most cases, they're picking their raters. So it's not anonymous who's at least invited, but we're keeping it confidential who actually participated. We're certainly not tying results back to individuals. We have thresholds in place. Yeah.
Except for the supervisor. Often that person's known, but the rest we try to bucket together.
Exactly. The supervisor himself would be the exceptions, but for direct reports, for peers, for people willing to invest in feedback, we're able to manage personal risk and keep confidentiality intact. And, we get phone calls all the time where people are saying, hey, I got an email from this company. Tell me about confidentiality, and we'll walk them through it. But having that third party is helpful, especially for this group. All right. Choose the right raters. Involve a diverse group of raters, include peers, direct report supervisors, and subordinates. Now, this is an interesting one for this group because a lot of times deskless workers don't necessarily have direct reports. Sometimes, often they do as well, but many cases we'll see the deskless population where they're individual contributors and they don't have direct reports. And so you want to make sure you're thinking a little bit more broadly, especially if they're customer or client service. You might include some of those populations as a rater group. You might use internal customers. I'm thinking of, you might go bigger in peers. I'm thinking in healthcare settings, span of control for nurses, those can be pretty big teams. And so you have to really think through what shifts look like and who to include. But with our deskless population, sometimes there's a few other areas of complexity, but thinking through who should be involved in this, who can provide feedback. We want to make sure that there's enough, you get critical mass, so there's value in the exercise. All right. And now something I'm very passionate about, incorporate coaching. As much as we love and believe in computers and technology and our software product, especially our Spective platform that we love, there's no substitute for the human element in this process. A skilled coach, and it doesn't have to be a completely dedicated coach, but someone employing some best practices from the coaching mindset or some coaching methodology and in the approach to help someone, to help shepherd them through the feedback experience. is the biggest differentiator in a successful program.
And when we use the term coach, Christian, I think we're not saying someone that's like a certified coach or it's a professional. We're talking about a role. So a manager can serve the role as a coach if they're set up for success. And our point is they need to be set up for success, but anybody can be a coach, right?
Yeah. Exactly. There's a continuum, right? So we have our internal coaches here that coach for our clients all the time. We also build internal capability for coaches within HR teams. And that's a great model. That's probably my favorite model. Let's build internal capacity. So we do these certifications every month. But to your point, it's not always feasible to have that done, built, either to use our coaches or to have HR coach everybody, just because we know you're working with lean teams. But you can borrow just some good best practices and help managers be coaches, or help set up some other kind of system, even doing some group coaching work as well. But I thought it might be interesting to borrow a couple slides from our 360 cert. In fact, one of my favorites is this next slide, and this is we in our coaching certification, it's a 2-day session, and we go through a lot of great content, but we kind of set up this backstop early on. And we say, look, we'll give you a lot of great tools to use, but if you do these 3 things successfully in a coaching session, it'll really make a big difference. So just to give you kind of a simple foundation for that, if you do these 3 things: create safety, be present, and be curious as a coach. If you're helping someone through the feedback experience and helping shepherd them through that, if you do these 3 things: create safety. As I mentioned, people feel vulnerable. What is this experience? How is this information being used? So in a coaching session, if I'm helping someone either formally or informally with their feedback, one of the first things I do is say, okay, I'm part of the HR team, but in this session, I'm just your thought partner. This information is your report. This is for your growth and development. You get to choose who you share it with. Now, I only say that if that's all true. There's different ways of setting up programs, but they're looking for that early in the conversation. I need to feel safe so I can engage in this. So I do that early, and I'll repeat that if I feel like they're still not feeling comfortable. Be present. We talk a lot about the difference of a coach and a consultant. A consultant has to have all the answers. A coach is there with good questions. And I can't ask good questions if I'm not present. You have to be in the moment. And this is something I've learned. It's taken me a while, but that presence is one of the most meaningful aspects of the 360. In our certs, I often talk about, I ask the question, when was the last time someone said, hey, for the next 90 minutes, let's talk about you? It doesn't happen to most of us most of the time. At least it doesn't happen to me. Maybe I'm super dull. But to have someone say, hey, we're going to sit down and I'm going to be completely present with you because I'm invested in your growth and development. That means a lot to them. That we talked about the challenge of recognition, feeling seen as a Deskless worker is a big part of this. And that can be very meaningful. And then this last piece, be curious. If I show up as the consultant and try to tell them what to do, even if I'm objectively right, it's not the right experience. It's going to minimize what's possible. Versus if I'm there and I ask thoughtful questions and help them surface what they need to do, they're going to own that outcome to a greater extent. They're going to, by the way, surface things that I had no idea about, and they're going to come to a better action plan or better path for action if I'm able to help strengthen just their own discovery and help them surface the areas of opportunity versus if I coach. And I wish I could say I learned that day one, but it's taken me a while to get there.
The key about the coaching mindset is that it's something you can teach to managers, right? And if you think about a manager sitting down, walking through some feedback, and there's a piece of feedback that's not really great. A good question from a manager is, why do you think they felt that way? Or has anyone else ever expressed that to you? Or, so the power of questions and operating from a coaching mindset is a really great concept, Christian. And but it is something we can empower managers. We can't teach every manager to be the world's best consultant, but we can teach HR teams, internal coaches, as well as managers, how to have a coaching mindset.
Yeah. And going earlier to your conversation around, well, we're here to make sure people are having better conversations. This can really strengthen that coach or that manager and employee relationship if it's done well. I also love the comment there. Emily had a really great comment about creating safety. It's emphasizing that my role is to support them, and the conversation is not part of their employee file to separate from. Yeah, if these are kept purely in that development space, that's such a powerful thing to state. Say, one of the things I say is, if I take notes, it's just to be a better thought partner. Or I will say, I'm not going to take notes here. This is, and I always encourage them to go and have further discussion. I'm going to police myself, because otherwise I'll just get into our coaching certification, which is great content. But I think it's some really great language Emily's using to help build that safety.
Christian, there was a question. Let me just see if I can put it into the stream. This was we struggled to balance the time and cost for follow-up coaching to a 360. Can you suggest how to think about setting a minimum number of hours to require for coaching of a 360? That popped away, but essentially, how do you give some guidance around that so it's not a one and done process? One thing I will say is the expectations, if managers are involved with this, it can't be just added on to a regular one-on-one. It needs to be a separate 90-minute session is a good number to think about, where the purpose is to have a coaching mindset and to help this person process and understand the feedback. It's a disruptive event. There's, as you said, Christian, they're seeing themselves differently. And so with a coaching mindset, we let them experience that. And you can't do that in 15 minutes. You need to go through the report and give it and spend some time with the person. Be present, as you said, but be present for long enough for it to really become a meaningful conversation.
Yeah, really great, really great. And a lot of our work is, especially since we're external coaches, that question really resonates with me, because we're always trying to say, look, I only have this one session with you. How can I set you up for additional follow-up? And a lot of times it is marrying or trying to pair them with a healthy dialogue with their manager. Hey, can you go talk to your manager? I also am really trying to drive action with action planning like I'll timestamp everything. What can you do by the end of this week to get 5% better at this? Once we pick a goal area. Anyway, I'm getting into coaching.
Or also, what can you do to leverage the strengths you have, right? We don't want to turn this into just always a session of, here are your gaps. What are you going to go fix them? It can also be a strengths-based approach of, hey, how are you going to do more of that to really support the team? And I know you know that, but I just want to throw that in there.
Oh, it's such a good point. And, one of the most powerful things we do in the 360 is we attach it to a larger goal that they have, something they're trying to accomplish 6 to 12 months out. And then to your point, well, let's look at the strengths you have that are, how do you use those to get to that point? And also, where do we see some of these opportunities in there? So there's a lot that coach can do to unlock this and make this. And again, that coach is just whoever's helping them. We just recommend they have some support as they get through this feedback.
And so if I'm sitting down thinking about doing a program of 360s for deskless workers, I hope a takeaway that you're getting from this webinar is, I need to think about this support process. How do I build internal capability that these conversations can be meaningful and that they can take place? That's a key component. It's not just selecting the right instrument, the right questions, the right raters, or the right technology. I think maybe more importantly, it's, do we have what it takes institutionally to have great conversations?
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Just one more thought on Kevin's question. One thing I have seen done, although I don't know that it works everywhere, but when you run a cohort of people through all at the same time, I have seen people go through an initial coaching and then be paired with other members of that cohort as accountability partners. So if they're not working with their manager, they've got a peer that they're checking in and working on goals with. But again, every approach has some trade-offs, but manager is probably the go-to that we would. So there's so many other things. Simplicity was something we could talk a lot about. There's other things to do to try to optimize this for the deskless population, but I think those 6 stood out as some quick hits. I do want to emphasize that a 360 is a powerful component of an overall structured listening approach, that we're doing these regularly, and have some. There is a strategic place for 360 feedback assessment in our overall strategy.
There's a study by Harvard Business Review found we like to spend a lot of time on traits, leadership traits, characteristics, competencies. And this study concluded probably the most important is self-awareness, right? And so we're passionate about that. Obviously, that's going to ring true to us as a feedback company, but it's foundational. If people are not self-aware, they really can't grow in the other areas. This is the beginning, and this is a great tool to create self-awareness, to have that event where you really step back and say, what is it like to work with me, around me, for me, below me? What is the experience I'm creating for others? And is it the experience I want? Am I showing up the way I want to show up? Do I have a personal brand that I'm proud of and that is known for value? Yeah. You can't know that really unless you get this feedback. And that's what to put it in modern TikTok parlance, this is about a personal brand. And so if someone's been with the company for 3 years, like, well, why do I need a 360? So you know how you show up, right? So you know what your brand is.
It's very well said. I'm gonna follow you on TikTok after this. But I love that conversation. That's one of my favorite coaching questions, which is, hey, if we continue on this path that you're on, are you going to end up somewhere you're happy, or where would you make an adjustment? How can we get there quicker where you want to go? It's so powerful, and I love that you came back to this question. I modified it a bit because, as we zoom out and think through this deskless population, we can ask this: what experience are we creating for our deskless employees, especially around growth and development, and is it the right experience? And so we would suggest that you incorporate 360 feedback effectively for these populations, and we'd love to chat with you about how we've seen that done well. I also just wanted to put in a plug here. We do these webinars every month, and I'll set this up if there's any questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat. We're getting close on time, but we'd also welcome any other ideas for topics. We live in the world of employee feedback. We work with organizations across every industry, from 50 employees to 100,000 plus employees, organizations. We would love some feedback from the group in terms of if there's any topics you'd be dying to hear from. And again, you don't have to, if we don't catch in the chat, hit us up at info@DecisionWise.com. We'd love to hear from you. And also, please take advantage of any of those resources on our website. We love just being part of this community.
If you're on this, there's an email ready to go afterwards. It'll come out to you shortly with information about your continuing ed credit as well as the slides. So I wanted to let you know that that'll be coming.
Excellent. If there aren't any questions here, I think we can wrap up. But such a fun topic, very kind of a little more niche than we normally go, but deskless workers, such a big part of the world's workforce, and a population we all rely heavily on. So we think there's certainly a place for effective 360s for this group. So thank you all. Appreciate your engagement and conversation, and we'll look forward to having you on the next one.